Um, okay, yeah, so today I'm happy to introduce Jacob Andreas. He recently did his PhD at Berkeley and is now a assistant professor at MIT working on topics in natural language processing, including symbolic reasoning and combining symbolic reasoning and deep learning. And today he's going to be talking about some work on implicit symbolic reasoning in deep neural networks. So yeah, it's great to have you here, and yeah, I'll hand it over to you, Jacob.
Great, thanks. Yeah, and great to be here. And so what this talk today is really about is not so much, sort of building explicit symbolic structure into neural networks from the beginning, but taking relatively unstructured models and trying to find evidence for structured computation in them after the fact. And I want to start here with a point that probably for this particular group, I don't need to convince you of too much, which is that when I have some kind of automated decision-making process, it's very nice to have that process take the form of some kind of short symbolic program, right? That if I have a function that I claim is a function that sorts lists, and I present it to you in the form that's on the slide right now, it's very easy for you to verify that this function, in fact, does what it claims to do. Oh, I guess I got this slide backwards. This is a function that unsorts lists, but imagine them reversed the other way, right? And especially if I sort of give you nice symbolic code like this, and I've named all the subroutines in comprehensible ways, I've named my variables in ways that are informative about their function, then it's really easy for you to reason about what it is that this program does. And more generally, given a structured representation of a behavior like this, we can modularly do things like test subroutines for correctness or replace them with alternative implementations that are sort of specialized to our data distribution or what have you. And most importantly, now, thanks in part to work by a lot of the people who are involved in this NSF Center, we have good tools for producing programs like this automatically, right? And so the programming languages community in particular has developed a lot of extremely sophisticated algorithms for searching in the space of programs and sort of building program synthesis tools that can take us from like abstract specifications of behavior like tests or from input-output pairs into programs that generate those input-output pairs or satisfy tests or whatever. And we would love in a perfect world for every automatic decision or every automated prediction to be generated by some sort of process that looks like this. But of course we can't, because for lots of the problems that we care about, prototypically things like image recognition, but basically anything to do with perception or language or to a lesser extent control, we don't know how to write down nice, clean symbolic code like this for solving these kinds of problems. And what we do know how to, or do what we do know how to do instead is to train deep neural networks, right? And so if you give me a collection of images paired with labels saying whether those are images of cats or not, it is very easy for me to find an alternating sequence of linear and nonlinear transformations, which is to say a neural net, that turns all of my inputs into my outputs. And in contrast to how we usually think about searching over programs or reasoning about programs, we can find these neural networks using the easiest search algorithm in the world, which is stochastic gradient descent. And these neural networks that we get out are programs, right, in the sense that we can write them down with code like we were looking at here, but they're programs of a very poor kind. They're just a bunch of matrix multiplies without any of the sort of nice structure or transparency that we were looking at on the previous slide. But this doesn't mean that that structure isn't there. And in particular, there's enormous literature in cognitive science and linguistics and vision science suggesting that there are interpretable and reusable and maybe even sort of underlyingly symbolic abstractions that we as people use for tasks like scene understanding or language processing. And so it's natural to wonder whether gradient descent, our super simple search algorithm, coupled with neural networks, our super generic class of model architectures, actually discovers these same symbolic abstractions, and that if it does, how we might go about finding And so that's really what this talk today is going to be about. The first half of the talk is going to be trying to understand what individual neurons are doing by labeling them with programs that bottom out in sort of perceptual or linguistic operations that we have names for. And then the second half of the talk is going to be aimed at trying to understand not just circuits and individual feature computations in deep networks, but actually like representations of dynamic state in models for language processing in particular. I'll say here, I can't see the chat, so if people have questions, please just interrupt me. Good, so let's jump into the first piece of this, and the sort of main piece of work we're talking about here is in a paper called Compositional Explanations of Neurons, on which Jesse Mu was the first author. That was at NeurIPS last year, but I'll be talking about some more recent experimentation at the end as well. Okay, so our goal in this section is to answer the following question. How can we understand the function of a single neuron inside some sort of deep network that's been trained to do some particular task? And one sort of standard way to do this, this is a question that has been the subject of a huge amount of work in the machine learning and HCI literature. And one of the sort of standard ways to do that is via some kind of visualization. So I'm going to point at an individual neuron in my network. I'm going to present it with a bunch of inputs, images, or whatever, and I'm going to ask it which images or which regions of images most strongly activate that neuron. And we're going to think of this set of sort of representative inputs or most activating inputs as some kind of explanation of what it is, what sort of computation this particular neuron is implementing. And what we can see here from these four images is that this one that we've picked out in this model is basically some kind of lamp detector. But there are limits to this sort of visualization-based paradigm, the most important of which that it's cognitively demanding for humans to do, right? This sort of, here's a set of images, guess what they all have in common, or spot the difference, is like literally a game that we give to children to play because it can be made a hard task. And so if I want to ask questions in the aggregate, like what kinds of neurons does this network pay attention to? It's going to be very difficult to automate this process if all we have for understanding what a neuron does is showing examples of representative inputs. Fortunately, we can do one better than this by using words to summarize these sets of visual explanations of neuron behavior. So looking at what this might look like in an image classification setting, say I have a data set of images. I can get a bunch of people to label those images or to label regions of those images with the visual concepts they express, right? So I can get someone to go in and say, okay, here's a set of pixels that pick out a bed, or here's a set of pixels that pick out art, or here's a set of pixels that pick out a dresser. And now I can think of the meaning of bed or the meaning of lamp as corresponding to a set of regions in this data set that I've annotated. And then I can basically ask just how those regions overlap with the neuron that I'm trying to explain. So if somebody comes to me with, this neuron that I have on the left that responds to these four images that we're drawing here, we can ask, okay, which of my labeled concepts in my labeled data sets most looks like the set of image regions that this neuron is picking out. And here we can notice that, the sort of regions that this neuron likes overlap the most with regions that we labeled lamp in all of the images that we had before. And so we can tentatively label this neuron some kind of lamp detector based on the similarity between the regions that it picks out and the regions that our natural language labels pick out. We say natural language, but really these are just words. On the basis of this, I can conclude that this particular thing is a lamp detector. And more generically, I can think of this as a procedure for looking at a neuron and automatically assigning it some sort of, visual category that describes what it corresponds to. This is such a good idea that it's been invented a bunch of different times. So both Antonio Giraldo's group at MIT and a bunch of people at Facebook have been looking at it for a long time in the context of visual recognition. Some colleagues at Berkeley and I did it for explaining multi-agent communication. You can apply it to standard natural language processing models where your concepts are not things like lamp or dresser, but instead things like prepositional phrase or main verb. And it's really quite a powerful paradigm in the sense that it allows you to come up now with like bulk characterizations, of the visual concept space expressed by networks for vision, right? So I can sort of label every neuron in my image classifier with the visual concept that it corresponds to. And then I can ask, well, how many of these are object level things? How many of them are texture level things? How many of them are part level things? And gain some kind of insight into, at a high level, how these kinds of networks organize their representational spaces.
Just to clarify something, where did the meaning of lamp come from? Like, was it as a label in a segmentation?
Yeah. So here, think of this as a semantic segmentation data set. And I think, for some of these labels, it literally is a semantic segmentation data set. So somebody has labeled a bunch of pixels as these are the lamp pixels, and somebody else has, labeled other pixels, these are the bed pixels. And so what I'm trying to do to explain, what this neuron is doing is saying, think of this neuron also as a function from images to sets of pixels that have been picked out. What's the most precise definition that I can come up with for these sets of pixels?
Got it.
What visual concept overlaps the most with the concept expressed by this particular neuron? Yeah, other questions about how sort of this version of the procedure works? Okay, hearing none, we will move on. So it lets us, doing this and labeling neurons just with these, sort of atomic visual categories, lets us understand a lot about what networks are doing, but not everything. So here's another neuron in an image classifier. And if we run the procedure that we were talking about on the previous slide, or one version of any of the 4 procedures mentioned on the previous slide, we're going to label this neuron as a bull ring detector. That the set of regions that it picks out with respect to the sort of vocabulary of visual primitives that I have access to overlaps more with bull ring than anything else. And it's true that on one hand, this neuron is responding to images of bull rings. That's this top left corner. But it's also true that it is definitely not a bull ring detector, that it's responding to lots of other regions of lots of other images that depict things other than bull rings, right? We have a volleyball court, we have a baseball diamond, we have some kind of horse racing track or something. So a natural question to ask is whether we can come up with a more precise description of what it is that this neuron is doing than just the sort of single object or texture level category that most closely aligns with it, and that will let us explain all of these other things as well. And the sort of fundamental problem here is that there isn't any single word in our vocabulary of primitive visual concepts that captures what it is that this neuron is doing, even though intuitively we can see that what it's doing is recognizing the disjunction of a bunch of different sports facilities. And so what we'd really like to do is be able to find some kind of arbitrarily, structured compositional description that we can apply to patterns of neuron responses, something that might let us label this as a stadium or field detector. And so the question is, how can we generalize these sort of primitive concept level descriptions of individual neurons to structured compositional explanations that look more like the ones that we have on the slide? And the cool thing here is that this is basically a program synthesis problem, in the sense that I can think of what I want to do now as finding not just some sort of primitive concept, but some composition of these concepts according to some sort of structured compositional language that lets me describe more precisely different regions of these input images, right? So I can do something like the following. If I have a set of inputs and I have a set of patterns of neuron responses to those inputs, I can start by first, so let me actually throw up the low-level predictions of the neuron that we're trying to explain here and give everyone 30 seconds to guess what they think this neuron is actually doing. Okay, so to explain what this neuron is doing, we're going to do the following. We'll start with all of our primitive visual concepts taken, like we said before, from a semantic segmentation data set or something like that, that says these are the regions containing water, these are the regions containing things that are blue, and so on and so forth. And we can notice that none of these, all that precisely overlaps with the neuron that we're trying to describe right now. But we can extend this. We can say, well, instead of just being able to label neurons as water, what if I can label them as water or river by taking the disjunction of pixels that are labeled with water or pixels that are labeled with river? Or what if I can label, neurons as not blue by taking the complement of regions that are labeled blue, and so on and so forth. And so I can actually search in the space of logical forms built from these primitive recognizers until I find a logical form that represents a computation that looks more closely like the neuron that I'm trying to explain here. And if we do it, for this particular neuron and this particular set of primitive concepts that we have, we can actually recognize this as a neuron that responds to regions of images containing water, but only when that water is not blue. And this is really sort of the whole trick in the first half of the talk, is to say, let's try to label individual neurons in networks now, not with primitive visual concepts, but instead with little compositional programs that look like this and that bottom out in primitive detections for these visual concepts.
Sorry, I have a question.
Yeah.
I probably missed something. Just to clarify, do you take an input, mask regions out that you, or unmask some region that you care about, and then input it to the neural network and try to see if that neuron in question fires in some sense?
Well, you can think of it as being the same. I mean, basically what we're doing, the neurons that we're looking at here are for these visual examples right now are in convolutional parts of the network. So they have little receptive fields. So we can actually ask, for this region of the image, was the neuron active or not, as opposed to, in this image as a whole, was it active or not? Right. So like for the coming back here, in this image on the left, I have some convolutional filter that I'm sweeping over the entire image. And these are the regions of the image in which a particular neuron in that convolutional filter fired.
Got it. So there is no pre-masking going on. The input is still in the same distribution
Yes.
that it was trained on. Got it.
Yes.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, and this is, we can do this at the sort of level of regions of inputs in ConvNets in particular, because they have this, you're getting predictions or at least feature responses at the level of regions that are smaller than the whole input. We're going to see some NLP examples later where that's not true, and where you're just getting basically like features that fire or fail to fire for an entire string.
Got it. Got it. Thanks.
Yeah, other questions about how this works?
Just maybe this is getting a little bit ahead, but is there any regularization for the complexity of the explanation, or?
You hold that question. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so what can we do with a procedure like this? One thing that we can do is go back to our bull ring detector before and see if we can come up with a more precise description of the bull ring detector. And so if we let ourselves generate an explanation with up to 4 primitives in it, then we label this as a bull ring or pitch or volleyball court detector. If we allow ourselves to generate an even more complicated explanation, we actually find something very specific about what this neuron responds to, namely that it responds to a bunch of different sports facilities, like we said before, but it doesn't respond to to football fields, and it doesn't respond to regions of images containing railings most of the time, although maybe not all the time. Right, and so this is important because this is something that's really not responding to football fields as something that is not at all visually apparent just from a particular set of 4 images or 5 images or 10 exemplar images or whatever. And we're having these kinds of structured programmatic explanations really allows us to understand much more precisely what a unit in a network that we're looking at is actually doing. What else can we do this? And this is sort of right to Osbert's question, is to ask what happens as we allow these explanations to get more and more complex. And one thing that we see here is that there's a sort of so I guess first of all to say what we're looking at on this chart is on one hand the size of the explanation measured as the number of primitive concepts from which the explanation is built. So sort of words in these things that are not and or are not. And on the y-axis, what we're looking at is basically the precision with which we're able to explain the neuron's predictions. So like here specifically the intersection over union of the region picked out by our logical form and the actual region picked out by the neural net. And what we see is that, as we let these explanations or these descriptions get grow in size and complexity up to a length of about 10, the quality of the regions that were, or of the approximations that we're able to produce also grows at a pretty fast rate, and above 10, it basically stops. And so there's some limit to basically our ability to overfit with these kinds of descriptions, and that basically once you've used 10 primitives, you are no longer more precisely explaining anything in the network. And this tells us something basically about the complexity of the concepts recognized by the features themselves, at least when we try to ground that measure of complexity out in these high-level visual primitives. The other thing that we can do is just look at a bunch of the labels that we generate for individual neurons in models trained to do things like scene classification. And so like we were looking at with our sports field detector, a lot of what you get are sort of very coherent semantic abstractions, towers, where we have a neuron that responds to skyscrapers or lighthouses or water towers, white objects in bathrooms, a neuron that responds to sinks or bathtubs or toilets. You see also a bunch of things where basically there is some sort of meaningful perceptual abstraction going on, but that we don't have quite the right vocabulary to describe here, right? So we have a colorful sphere detector that we label as a ball pit or orchard or bounce game detector, a sort of vertical slat recognizer that we label as a cradle or bus or fire escape detector. What else do we find? We find things like our friend, the water, but not blue neuron that we were looking at before. And here are some more examples of image regions where that fires. And you can see that really it is responding to sort of green water and brown water, but not blue water, and other things that pick out, sort of narrow spatial regions like images of attics, but only the parts of the attics that are not the floor. And finally, and most interestingly here, we find evidence for all kinds of neurons inside these deep networks that don't correspond to any kind of meaningful semantic or perceptual abstraction that people have, right? So we find an individual neuron in our scene classifier that is an operating or castle or bathroom detector, another neuron that responds to bakeries or bank vaults or shop fronts. And what these suggest either is that there is some sort of high-level perceptual thing that this model thinks all of these have in common, that's just like not at all apparent to people, or that because these visual categories are sufficiently distinct from each other, the model has figured out that it's able to like overload this neuron to do multiple different things because you're never really going to need to reason about whether what you're looking at is a castle or a bathroom, because those things don't occur in at all the same distribution in images. And we'll come back to the implications of the existence of these kinds of neurons in a minute.
A quick question. So what is this model that you're looking at?
Oh, that's a great question. Sorry, I didn't say that. This is, I think, a ResNet trained to do classification on the MIT Places data set. So the top level categories are things like sports field or outdoor scene. I think fire escape is actually one of the top level categories. Orchard might be one of the top level categories. And so you see a mix of neurons, especially late in the network, that have like already figured out what the top level category is, and lower level stuff like our water detector.
So are the things that are mixed up, do they in any way correspond to things that maybe the neural network isn't trained to discriminate? Is there any correlation there? Or
well, so you are certainly, I guess it depends on what you mean by not being trained to discriminate. Like there are, there is a label that gets assigned to, I think in this data set, ball pit and orchard are both scene level categories. So the model at some layer is going to have to discriminate between those things, but it doesn't do them here. And we'll see a very specific example of this happening in a couple of slides. But yeah, no, that's a good question. One other point I'll make though is that you can do this for models in tasks other than visual recognition. So here we are applying the same technique to a model that's trained to do a task called natural language inference in NLP. The details of the task are not super important if you haven't seen it before, but basically you're presented with a pair of sentences like a guy pointing at a giant BlackBerry and a woman tearing down a giant display. And you have to figure out whether those sentences can possibly be describing the same situation or not. And you label it a contradiction if they cannot be describing the same situation, and entailment if one of them implies that the other one must also be describing the same scene, and neutral if they're possibly consistent and possibly inconsistent. And the important thing is if we apply this procedure to models trained for this natural language inference task, we see features that are problematic in a different way, namely that there's an individual feature that fires here if one of these sentences contains the word man and the other sentence does not contain the word man. And the important thing to notice here is that, this kind of, and I'll say that this particular feature is actually coming from the very last layer of this model. This feature is going to be like directly used by a linear layer to predict the presence of a contradiction or an entailment relation between the pair of sentences. And the important thing to notice is that the presence of the word man in one sentence and the absence of the word man from the other sentence doesn't really tell you anything at all at this layer about whether the sentences entail each other or contradict each other, right? It's very easy to come up with sentences where, one of them contains the word man and the other one contains the word person, where there's an entailment relation, or one of the sentences contains the word man and the other doesn't contain the word man, but they are describing the same scene with just like slightly different ways. So this feature is picked up on some sort of like very shallow inference heuristic for solving this task. And is like not actually doing the reasoning that you need to solve to compute entailment relations between sentences in language in general. And so, interestingly enough, if you look at the relationship between the quality of the best explanation that we were able to generate in this way and the accuracy of the model conditioned on the particular neuron that you're explaining firing, you see very different relations between these two tasks, right? So in this vision task, basically the more explainable neurons, the neurons for which our best explanation has high overlap with the actual regions to which that neuron responds, are positively correlated with associations with the network. So more explainable neurons, when they fire, are likely to be, sort of weakly likely to be involved in accurate predictions. On this natural language inference task, the opposite thing is true. The more explainable you are as a neuron, the more likely it is that when you fire, the model's prediction is wrong. And what we think is going on here is basically that this natural language inference task requires reasoning that is much more complicated than can be encoded in little logical forms like this. So to the extent that you are well described by some sort of logical form, you've basically learned to cheat at the task rather than to actually model the reasoning that's required. And therefore, when you fire, you are not necessarily going to be all that well correlated with generalization to the test set. Right, so just to say this in another way, on this natural language inference task in particular, better explanations actually translate into worse predictions from the model. And finally, as an example of ways in which we can use these kinds of logical or programmatic explanations to reason about model behavior, here's an example of a little subcircuit inside one of these models at the very last layer. So we're looking on the right-hand side here at the output class viaduct, right? A viaduct is something that conveys cars as like a freeway overpass or a highway or something like that. And this viaduct output unit is connected, among other things, to a bunch of input units, one of which we have labeled as washer or laundromat or viaduct. So again, as Osbert was asking before, here's a sort of neuron internal to the network that doesn't discriminate between two classes that are going to have to be discriminated at the output of the network. And in particular, we have both this object level thing, a washer, a scene level thing, a laundromat, and a scene level thing, a viaduct. And all of these are disjoined, and the neuron is happy to respond to any of the three. So knowing that this neuron that responds to washing machines is connected to the viaduct layer at the output, we can do the following. We can take an image of an outdoor scene that not only the model that we're looking at here, or ResNet 18, but every other image classifier that you train on this places data set labels as a forest path. We will insert into this outdoor scene a bunch of washing machines. And now not only the model with this particular circuit that we're looking at on this slide, but a bunch of other models trained on the same data set confidently classify this image as an image of a viaduct. Now, you might ask what the right image for this scene is, right? In the sense that it's not obviously a forest path anymore because there are washing machines in the forest. It's not obviously a laundromat because laundromats aren't usually outside. But whatever this thing is, it's not a picture of a viaduct. And the important thing here is that we were able to sort of exploit the fact that this washing machine unit is connected to the viaduct unit to build this like Photoshop adversarial attack where inserting a particular image into this larger image has a predictable effect on the downstream behavior of the model. Okay, so, and this is basically it sort of technically and prediction-wise for the first half of the talk. The point is just that you can use program induction techniques essentially to come up with these kinds of programmatic descriptions of neurons and programmatic descriptions of circuits inside deep models, and then use these to make predictions about how those models are going to behave. One point I want to make, though, is that all of the examples that we've been looking at so far involve a very simple set of primitive concepts and very simple logical composition operators, right? But if you actually look inside these models and you try to label individual neurons yourself, say using language, you find much more interesting compositional concepts, right? You find evidence for spatial relations like sides of cylinders. You find part-whole relationships like something that responds to legs, but specifically legs of birds. You find really, really low-level perceptual stuff like high contrast diagonals that go from the top left corner of the image to the bottom right corner of the image. And so there is a lot more interesting compositional structure that we could explain if we only had the right vocabulary to explain it. And this list goes on. So even if we restrict ourselves to the visual domain, you find these kinds of complicated models or concepts in models for visual recognition. You find it in models for image generation. In fact, if you can sort of label concepts in this way in GANs, you can use it to do controlled fine-grained manipulation of the content of images by saying, find me a like latent Z in my generative model that causes all the neurons labeled jockey to turn on. But the really important thing here is just there's a lot of complexity, and we find this complexity in all the models that we look at, but that a lot of this complexity is actually explainable if you have the right set of primitives and the right set of composition operators. The other high-level point that I want to make, is that this complexity exists for basically every neuron. And so if we think about this really as an explainability technique, and if the goal of explainable machine learning or explainable deep learning specifically is to produce descriptions of models or characterizations of models that help users understand them, then what we've done here is actually sort of useless, right? That we can't show everything on this slide to a user as an explanation of a model's behavior. There's way too much information here, only some of which is actually going to be relevant or interesting to a human decision maker who's trying to do something with a model. So just sort of pointing to future work, I think one thing that's really interesting, once you have the ability to generate these kinds of structured descriptions of neurons, is to then extract from those sets of descriptions those that are relevant. Finding both things that are sort of weird and non-semantic, like the neuron that responds to animals and parts of wheels, and things that are sensitive and that require close scrutiny, regardless of how faithful they are as concepts, like what the model thinks human skin looks like. And this is something where I think the NLP literature offers a bunch of tools for approaching this problem. Okay. So to summarize the first half of the talk, the main takeaway here is that lots of features in deep models for vision tasks, for NLP tasks, can be accurately characterized by compositional logical forms or by more general programs of the kind that we've been looking at. And that you can use these to understand a lot about what it is that your model does. And one of the things that you learn is that symbolic interpretability in this sense doesn't always translate into sort of good behavior by the model, into predictability of model behavior or adversarial robustness. And I will stop here before going on to the second part.
I have a question. So you talked about the difference between your observations in the vision task and the natural language NLI task. I was wondering, I'm curious about what kinds of features were used for the explainability part in NLI, because the example which you showed, it sort of gave this idea of bias. But I'm also curious if something similar was observed for vision, right? Where the model would look at a person having long hair and try to think of that person as a woman or something like that.
Yeah. Well, so the features that we're using here are, if I remember, lexical features, so things that just fire for the sort of presence or absence of individual words. I think some part of speech features as well, or some high-level syntactic structure, and features just describing sort of word overlap between the input and the output, which are meant to capture this other category of inference heuristics that just look at like, do the sentences look very similar to each other? In the visual domain, these are scenes where bias like, well, gender bias isn't super relevant because none of these situations like involve that many people in the first place. One sort of relatively narrow thing that is sort of the same kind that we see is actually in the context of the not blue water neuron. This is connected to the swimming hole output class. So the swimming hole output class wants to respond to outdoor scenes containing water when the water is not blue. And if you just like, again, reach in with Photoshop and recolor the water in an image, that will generally cause all the classes to which this water and not blue neuron is connected to turn off and other classes to turn on instead.
Got it. Another small follow-up question. So the conclusions which you described of the correlations, the positive and the negative correlations. So it feels to me like that the features you used for the NLI tasks are not something that a human would use to do perform the same task. While for vision, it does feel like some high-level concepts are something that a human would use to do the classification. So do you think that these conclusions are sensitive to the kinds of features which were used to perform these explanations?
Yes, absolutely. Right. And I think what you're saying about NLI is exactly right. The more interesting question is whether there is any symbolic vocabulary you could write down that would allow you to like express the sort of right rules for this task as programmatic explanations of this kind. In the context of NLI in particular, this is actually super interesting because like the original, the linguistic theory from which all of this was derived is called natural logic, and is all about how if I have a pair of sentences, can I derive from a bunch of like word level alignments and word level entailment or contradiction relations, the relationship between the sentences as the whole. And so there are rule-based models that do this, and they don't actually work very well on natural data. Apparently these deep neural models do much better on natural data, but I think mostly because they're able to learn to cheat using rules like this rather than actually learning the underlying structure of the task, whatever that is.
Got it. Just a quick last question. So this brings up the question. So was this tried for a more natural NLP task like sentiment analysis, where you could design symbolic features which are good explanations?
Yeah, I don't know if I'd describe sentiment analysis as a natural task. I mean, the thing about sentiment analysis is, to first order, it's just like negation scope plus figuring out what words are in a sentence. So I'm not sure you would actually find interesting things there. We did some very early machine translation experiments, and they were mostly just picking up on so there's other NLP literature on sort of figuring out what individual features do, and we recapitulated a lot of the there's a thing that keeps track of when you're inside quotation marks, and there's a thing that fires when you're looking at a noun, or fires when you're looking at a verb. But NLI was the most interesting in terms of surfacing things that we didn't know were encoded in individual neurons. But yeah, the kinds of conclusions that you draw and the kinds of labels that you generate very much depend on the form of the language that you use to generate these explanations.
Thanks.
I have a question. I found it really surprising that different neural network architecture arrive at the same logical formula, and they make mistake in the same way. I don't have any intuition of why that is, but it seems then it reached this kind of logical conclusion, not as a function of different learning procedure on the neural network and the architecture, but more as a function of the data, right? So it's like this logical form is basically by manipulating the data, you could trick it into learning different logical forms. So if you have these kind of adversarial example that make it wrong, then the natural way to patch it would be, can you do like active learning to be like, we need more viaduct images, and you throw them into the data set, this will go away? Like what do you think? Like what's up with, I don't know. It's just a comment.
Yeah, no, that's great. So I guess to be very precise here, we're not claiming that this particular logical form is present in all these other models, although I bet it actually is, but that it is in the ResNet, and that you then, by designing this prediction for the ResNet, are also able to fool a bunch of other models. So one explanation of what's going on here is that what this feature actually is recognizing is like circles or arch shapes in between white things, and that is like a reasonable, as a perceptual abstraction, description of both a viaduct and a washing machine. And therefore, when you see that high-level perceptual pattern in an outdoor scene, you want to classify it as a viaduct, and when you see it in an indoor scene, you want to classify it as a washing machine. And so then the important thing that this neuron is surfacing is exactly the fact that it can actually distinguish between washing machines and pylons for viaducts or whatever, even this late in the network, and that's the confusion that all of these models are picking up on. Right, and so as you say, one thing that you can do is to use this for active learning and to say, hey, I trained my model, it has this weird looking abstraction inside it. Collect some data such that abstraction goes away, or give me a bunch of, more images of washing machines and more images of viaducts such that I can do a better job of telling them apart. Another thing that you can imagine doing at training time would even be to say, hey, as I'm doing SGD, look at each neuron, find the best description of each neuron, and when the best description is something suspicious like washing machine or viaduct, then penalize that, and have it sort of like regularized towards meaningful concepts in the loop at training time. Now, major computational challenges associated with that, in the sense that now, like every time you want to take a step of SGD, you have to run this whole procedure, which is not super fast because we're just doing intermittent search. And what's an interpretable concept or a like semantic concept is sort of fraught. You might actually want your white arches detector lower down in the network. But I think there are a bunch of things that you could do, certainly to use these to influence prediction behavior at training time.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Okay, well, I said the second half of the talk, but we now have like 10 minutes left. So let me see how far we can get here and how much of this I can skip over. Okay, so what I want to talk about very briefly now is not symbolic representations of features, but instead symbolic representations of sort of semantic state in the context of natural language generation. So to just sort of set this problem up, right, it's an exciting time to be thinking about generating language right now. For an example of why, I want us to consider the following passage. This is an example due to Gary Marcus by way of Eugene Charniak's PhD thesis. Passage begins, Janet and Penny went to the store to get presents for Jack. Janet said, I will buy Jack a top. Don't get Jack a top, said Penny. He has a top, he will ... And if you take this passage and you hand it off to, the biggest, baddest language model that we have right now, you give it to GPT-3, it completes the passage saying, he will get a top, I will get Jack a top, said Janet. And this is interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, what's sort of remarkable about this completion is that it stays on topic. It knows who's involved in this conversation. It knows enough about social conventions to know that it's Janet who's likely to speak next in this conversation. And we get all of this complicated behavior just from sort of training a generic transformer language model on text. And I think as recently as like 5 years ago, this level of sort of nicely structured discourse was just not something that we thought was going to be possible with RNN or neural language models generally in the near future. But the other reason that this passage is interesting is that it's total nonsense, right? That Penny says, don't get him a top, he has a top. and then she says he has a top, he will get a top. Janet says that she's going to get him a top, right? So you cannot imagine any situation in which people would actually say this sequence of sentences. And so we're in this sort of wonderful state right now where things like work remarkably well for 50% of phenomena and are just total garbage for the other 50% of phenomena. And we would like to understand both, like, what are the representations of language in virtue of which we're able to do the stuff that works, and what do we have to fix the stuff that doesn't work. And it seems like the sort of what the model is able to do a little bit, but not entirely, is reason about the situation that it's describing, reason about the sort of world that is being conjured up by the text that has been generated here. And so it's natural to ask, sort of in the same way that we asked whether these neurons in our image classifiers were performing, sort of recognizing things that we could label as symbolic feature detectors, is there actually some kind of like symbolic simulation of the state of the world going on inside these neural language models? Well, what would it mean to represent the state of the world symbolically? And here is a sort of cartoon of how you might do that. There is a set of entities described by a sentence. Those entities are connected to each other via relations, right? So there's some sort of getting event that involves the store as its location, Janet as the agent, and so on and so forth. And this sort of picture that we've drawn here captures both everything that we know about the state of the world as described by the sentence, and everything that we don't know about the state of the world, right? It represents the fact that we're uncertain about whether Jack already possesses a top, we're uncertain about the color of the top that Janet is trying to buy from the store, and things like that. And as our discourse grows, and we're going to call this thing an information state, right? It represents the information that we have about the current state of the world. As our discourse grows, we will update that information state. So if we now add Jack already has a colorful top, we can expand our picture of the world to include that, hey, there's this new top sitting off to the side, it's possessed by Jack, it's colorful. And different sentences will cause us to update our representation of the world in different ways. Importantly, I can also describe things that have consequences that are not sort of explicitly represented in the text, right? So if I say Janet went to the store to get Jack a top, she gave it to them or they gave it to him, the final consequence is that we live in a world in which Jack possesses the top, even though this possession is not explicitly mentioned by the sentence. It's just like a side effect of something being given to somebody else. So this cartoon that we've been drawing comes from a sort of region of the linguistics literature called dynamic semantics, where we think of the meanings of sentences as functions from these information states to new information states. And so the question that we're going to ask basically is, do these big neural language models, to any extent at all, build up representations of the state of the world that look like these representations from dynamic semantics? In the interest of time, I'm not going to talk too much about how we actually look for evidence of these things, apart from saying basically that I'm going to build some sort of auxiliary model that sits off to the side, that looks at representations in this language model, and that tries to recover from those representations a structured description of the state of the world, like we have on the right-hand side of the slide. And the important thing, skipping over all the details here, is that you can actually do this with a linear model. So there is a sort of like single weight matrix that you can point at an individual set of tokens in an encoding of a sentence, like locked wooden door, that can read off the final state of that door as you get to the end of the passage. And so in particular, if you apply this to descriptions, sort of toy descriptions of laboratory protocols, to text adventure games, you can actually find evidence that these models are tracking the underlying state of the world in a structured way that can be recovered automatically with a very, very low capacity model. You can recover the exact state of all of the entities that have been mentioned, like close to 90% of the time in some of these tasks. This seems to be mainly a consequence of large-scale pre-training rather than a fine-tuning on in-domain text. And this information is stored like really in sort of highly local ways. So information about the final state of a given entity is generally going to be written into the initial mention of that entity in a document. And maybe the most important thing about this is that it actually works, again, as a sort of like causal theory of model behavior, so that I can take a document whose final consequence is that one beaker is empty. I can take another document whose final consequence is that a different beaker is empty. I can put together the representations of those two documents and convince the language model that I've given it a history of words describing a situation in which two beakers are empty, even though I didn't write down any words at all, and I just stitched together these representations of the state of the world from pieces of other representations of the state of the world that I saw in other places. And what you get downstream of that is actually language generation condition, consistent with this fictitious state of the world that you described by basically building in a fake encoder representation out of pieces of other situations. And that is really all I have time to say about this, other than, not surprisingly, you can make these underlying state representations better by actually teaching them what the real state of the world looked like at a given state and time, and that this translates into improved language generation. And that, in fact, given a choice between like a bunch of extra sentences or a little bit of information about the state of the world, you would rather train your language model not with language, but with this kind of grounded supervision instead. Good. And so I will actually wrap up the talk there to leave a little bit of time for questions. Important part of this section is that you can learn sort of the rudiments of like real linguist semantic representations just from input-output text in these language models. And basically that language model pre-training induces highly structured, moderately reliable representations of a kind that look very similar to sort of real structured representations that are used in the linguistics literature. And that it seems to be the case that these might actually even be useful for other kinds of downstream tasks other than language generation. And I will end there. So thank you very much for having me today.
Yeah, thanks so much for the great talk. And yeah, we do have a few minutes left, so if anyone has any questions, yeah, feel free.
Hi, I have one. I love the second part. Obviously the first part as well, but quick question about the second part. If you have any idea of, based on the experiments, if models are able to like break apart larger entities into its different constituents, track them, like, is there a feature of that, or are most of the entities in the data you look at kind of independent themselves?
Oh, like how do part-whole relations work?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, I have no idea. So one domain where I really want to look at this is cooking videos or cooking like recipes, where somebody says to you, "There's a carrot. Chop the carrot and divide the chopped carrot in two." Like, does it know that there are a bunch of teeny little pieces of carrot, or does it know that there are two distinct carrots? Let me think. I have some other interesting. Quantification generally is super interesting in like what do representations of entities and groups of entities and entities with internal structure look like. This is in fact like the main thing that most of dynamic semantics was designed to answer questions about in the linguistics literature. If you've seen, file card semantics, discourse representation theory, and like none of the interesting pieces of those are things that we've actually been able to study in these models yet, but super important.
And one maybe quick question. If there are discrete entities, I could still imagine there being hope of doing something like this. But what about like continuous properties and like things like red and like properties which are not co-referential most of the times, and things like those? I don't know how to exactly frame that question.
Yeah, well, so for example, we have our toy alchemy domain, and the way this domain works is that basically whenever you mix any pair of colors that are not the same, you wind up with a brown beaker. But does this model actually know that if I have 8 units of red and 1 unit of green, what I wind up with is something that's like a slightly browner red? Or if I have 8 units of blue and 1 unit of yellow, I get a sort of greenish blue. Yeah, and so it's both an interesting question of like, do big pre-trained language models know how color works in general, and if not, how much in-domain data do they need to learn that? And in particular, if you can provide grounded supervision where you say, not here's what the world looked like as in the form of a bunch of like logical propositions, but literally here is an image of the state of the world right now. Can you model this phenomenon better? I mean, the color is an interesting one because, like, in some sense, what we're doing here is this, the sort of famous Mary's room thought experiment where you have a super powerful scientist. She's locked in a room. She can read the entire scientific literature, but she's never been outside. She steps outside. She looks at the sky. Has she learned something new about the meaning of the color blue or not? And that's basically what we're getting at here.
I have a question if there's time. Is there time?
Yeah.
Cool. So great talk, by the way. So when you mentioned that for so there are things that you can express in natural language which can't be captured by the kind of the logical forms. And so I guess I have a general question about, like, what should we be doing in that kind of situation? And so as a kind of PL person, what we often do is define a relatively simple language and try to capture things in the domain with that language. And so I guess what should be the general approach if we know that these simple kind of logical forms are not expressive enough to capture kind of the reality? And so should we be adding more and more features to capture more and more of the world, or is there kind of a fundamentally different approach that you would suggest?
Yeah, well, so, I think the claim that you like fundamentally can't represent these things with logical forms is actually sort of controversial, and, that like most of a chunk of the formal semantics literature is explicitly concerned with coming up with logical forms that represent, everything on the slide. So I think there is hope for more sort of PL style approaches where what you're inferring are not literal strings, but logical forms that bottom out in programs with perceptual components, right? And so, I mean, like this whole center, right, is about neurosymbolic models, and you can imagine sort of semi-structured programs where you can do logical disjunction coupled with having some kind of neural net that knows how to recognize fur, or that knows, this sort of soft notion of what it means to be on the left side of something. And those seem like the right models to use as input to a procedure like this. That being said, there's a sort of like structure nihilist version of this that says, let's just go straight to the strings and learn like a captioning model that I can point at a neuron that will generate a freeform caption for that. And we have tried to do that, and it's actually very hard to design versions of those models that are reliable enough to use as drop-in replacements for these kinds of descriptions.
Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, I think we're out of time, but thanks so much, Jacob, for the great talk, and thanks everyone for coming. So I'll see everyone at the next seminar. And thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.